So a quick method that I like to do a lot of times is when I start by looking at this is I sort of start to break it down and kind of consider what shapes I'm going to need. And then I like to rapidly just start throwing down primitives and making adjustments to them as we move along so that we can quickly and easily, have some stuff basically here in 3D space that we can manipulate. Rather than trying to make every single box absolutely perfect one at a time, that can be very time consuming. Whereas if we start by creating a simple box and we imagine, sort of this piece here, we just kind of drag out a box for that, give it a little bit of depth. We're happy with that. Maybe we grab another box and we just sort of throw it down here as well. Maybe another quick one here, move it up. And this entire process is not at all to make it perfect. It's just to get a few pieces of geometry down rapidly so that we can sort of build our framework and then go in from here and start making adjustments to the mesh. This is a really, really quick way of blocking out your mesh and having a shape that you're happy with rather than trying to make everything absolutely perfect right off the bat. So as soon as we do this, one thing that I like to do also, and I'll show you this new feature here inside the software, is I like to work consistently on the grid, and I like to make sure that everything lines up correctly. Rather than being, relatively close to being in the center of the grid, I like to make absolutely sure that it is directly on the grid. And the reason for this will become clear when we start mirroring our objects and mirroring certain parts of the 3D geometry. And so what I mean by that, for example, is that we will only need to model one half of this object, and we can take advantage of our mirror tool to quickly make a copy of it over here off to the side. And so when you're working on something that's a symmetrical object, and what I mean by that is where the left and the right is almost exactly the same, think about it in terms of how little you actually need to model initially, and then just simply copying and duplicating that geometry off to the side. Now, to make sure that we stay on the grid as we get started here so that we can take advantage of our mirror tool, what I'll do is I'll start by grabbing some of these central post pieces. So for example, this is down the center, this is down the center, and this guy's down the middle. And I'm going to want to set their pivot point to the center of them and ensure that they are actually in the middle of the objects. Sometimes when you create a piece of 3D geometry, the pivot point can be in a little bit of an awkward position. So it's a good habit to start by clicking on the Hierarchy tab, Effect Pivot Only, and clicking Center to Object. And you'll notice that this new sort of a blue and red and green spinner pops up. And what we could do is we could manipulate the pivot point wherever we want it to go. And in this case, to quickly just center it, all we need to do is click the Alignment Center to Object. Now what the pivot point actually is as we select our object, you'll notice that that is from where we are able to move it, rotate it, and scale it. And so for example, if I Effect Pivot Only and move it over to here, when we go to move, rotate, and scale, now we are rotating and moving from that position there. So if we're working on something that's symmetrical where we know that, hey, this needs to be right down the middle, having a centrally located pivot point is ideal. So for these guys, we'll grab them, go to the Hierarchy tab, Effect Pivot Only, Center to Object, and make sure that they are perfectly in the center. Now that the pivot points are in the middle, the next step that we want to do is we want to physically move them onto the grid. And so if we switch to a top view, if you can imagine 3D space having numeric values of, for example, a +1 area over here, a -1 over here. If you're familiar with some of your old math classes where you've worked with a grid, it's very similar here in 3D space. Everything has either a positive number or a negative number along the X, Y, and the Z axes. And so if we take this object and we move it over here, you'll notice that along the X down here in the bottom, we start moving off into negative numbers. And then if we move it off to the right, it's positive numbers. Now, this isn't necessarily a math class, but I think what is the most important thing is that we move these objects to the 0, 0, 0 along this grid line, which is absolutely the center of our scene. Now, you can grab an object and you can kind of eyeball it and kind of try to get it close, but a faster way to do that is to simply grab the object, and down here on our spinner, if we hold down the mouse button, you'll see that it's starting to move up and down. And so if we know that if we snap this to 0 with a pivot point in the middle, that will actually snap the object to perfect grid alignment here along this axis. And so for example, we'll grab this guy, and even if he's over here somewhere, we can quickly just right click on that, and that will snap him to the 0, 0. And then we can just sort of manually move him into place. And if we go back to our perspective view, now I know for absolute certain that these guys are perfectly centered along the grid, which will be really handy for when I want to mirror a part of the dumbbell weights, for example, and sort of snap them over here to the opposite side. Now, in order to get these boxes the perfect scale, we could go into the Modify tab and sit here and try to kind of guesstimate using our length, width, and height parameters here to adjust. But personally, I find this to be a little bit slow and tedious. And unless you're working on some form of an architectural rendering where it has to be absolutely precise, it's just as easily accomplished by simply grabbing the piece that you're working with, switching to the transform mode that you need, whether it's move, rotate, and scale, and just sort of eyeballing it and getting it about as close as you need it to be. And so, for example, I can quickly look at this post here in the middle and say, well, I think it needs to be a little bit longer. So if you're rapidly going back and forth between your move, rotate, and scale, I can start to scale out the dimensions of the weight bench without having to spend a whole lot of time really trying to make it perfect over here using these rollouts. So for example, if I look at this and I say, well, he probably needs to be just a tad bit thinner. This guy here, this post, which is basically this back end post here, this definitely needs to be a bit thinner as well. Maybe bring him in just slightly. And I also, personally, when I press F4, this brings up the topology. Sometimes that kind of helps you see and visualize where the edges are on your 3D objects here. You can toggle that on and off by pressing the F4 key. And so when I look at this, I say, well, maybe he needs to be just a slight bit thicker, taller, thinner, whatever it is that you need to do in order to sort of block out that shape. Now, another trick that I have is when I have a selected piece of geometry, for example, let's look at this post here. If I hold down the Shift key, I can drag this up using the Move tool, and this will actually create a copy of the object. Now, a little bit later, we'll get into instances and references, but for now, a copy is fine. So if we press OK, now we have a copy of that post here along the side. You'll also notice that we're getting a bit of artifacting from this realistic shade setting on our mesh. And that can be a little bit distracting, and it can also slow down your scene just a bit. And so if you want to turn that off, up here in the top left-hand corner where it says realistic, all you need to do is left-click on that, and you can set that to any of these other viewport types, such as traditional shaded mode, consistent colors, edged faces, which is essentially the same as pressing the F4 key on and off, but is also used in conjunction with any one of these extra viewports, or rather view modes. So we can go ahead and leave that on shaded. This will get rid of some of that ambient occlusion, which was starting to look a little bit dirty along the edges here. So remembering that F4 toggles the topology on and off. Now that we have these two posts together, we can always scale them both at the same time until we find a size that works for us that looks just about right. This is probably pretty close. I'll go ahead and move these down just slightly. And for this post here, we'll go into a top view, and we'll move him just along the edge here, because back in perspective view, we know that this looks like it's sort of welded into with this piece here. And we'll scale this guy up a bit until it looks like it's fairly correct with being centered on there. And now being able to know that we make a copy of this, if we once again hold down the Shift key and drag out another copy of this box, I'll rotate this way. And if you don't get it exactly 90 degrees, we'll talk more about snaps later, but while you have the rotate tool, you'll notice that down here along the bottom, this is giving us a numeric value. We can also just type in 90 degrees there. And so now we know that we had a perfect 90-degree turn. We'll scale this shape in just slightly. And back in perspective view, we know that we're kind of looking at this little foot here along the side. Now, as I'm working, I'm not exactly falling in love with this bluish color. So what I want to do is select all the objects. And let's find something that's a little less overpowering. That gray color seems to work fairly well. but it can also be a little bit difficult to see when you're backed up against the backdrop of the screen. So we'll select all, and we'll pick a little bit of a softer blue.